It was New Year's Eve about 10 years ago, and that night remains burned into my memory for all the wrong reasons. My friends and I, full of excitement for the coming year, had gathered at Mark's parents' old country house for drinks before heading to a massive party. The party wasn't just any gathering, it was being held at an abandoned mansion on the outskirts of town. The place was notorious, rumored to be haunted, but that only added to its appeal. The mansion loomed as we approached, its crumbling facade barely illuminated by the light strung across its overgrown gardens. Music and laughter poured out of its cracked windows, and the faint smell of damp and decay mingled with the cold night air. People were spilling out onto the courtyard, gathered around a roaring bonfire. The excitement was infectious as we stepped inside. The interior was a strange mix of eerie and festive. The grand staircase creaked under the weight of people heading to the upper floors, and faded portraits on the walls seemed to watch the revelry with disapproval. Despite the spooky setting, the atmosphere was lively, with music blaring and drinks flowing. For the first hour or so, everything seemed perfect. But then I noticed them, 3 figures standing by the staircase. They wore dark coats, and one had his hood pulled low over his face. They weren't drinking or talking to anyone, just watching. Their presence felt out of place, like they were studying the crowd. I nudged Mark. "Do you know those guys?" I asked. Mark glanced over and shrugged. "Probably crashers. Chill out." I tried to brush off the unease, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. They moved through the crowd with purpose, as if they were looking for someone. Every time I turned around, they were in a new spot, silently observing. Around midnight, as the countdown began, the lights flickered. Cheers erupted as people counted down, but my attention was drawn to a pale girl standing near the back wall. She looked terrified, her eyes darting around like she was searching for an escape. "Hey, are you okay?" I asked, stepping closer. She grabbed my arm with icy hands. "You need to leave. All of you. They're not here for the party." "Who?" I asked, but before she could answer, a piercing scream tore through the air. The music stopped abruptly, and everyone froze. A crash followed from upstairs. And then chaos erupted. People screamed and bolted for the exits, but the 3 strangers moved quickly, blocking the doors. They wore masks now, smooth, featureless white faces that made them look inhuman. One of them raised his hand, holding a small, glinting object. "Everyone stays put," he growled, his voice distorted and unnatural. "What do you want?" someone shouted, but the masked figure didn't answer. Instead, he gestured to his companions, who began pulling people out of the crowd one by one. "We need to get out of here," I whispered to Sarah and Mark. "Where?" Sarah asked, her voice trembling. "There's a window in the kitchen," I said. "Follow me." We slipped away in the chaos, ducking into a dimly lit hallway. As we reached the kitchen, Sarah stopped suddenly. "Wait," she said, pointing to a small, half-open door we hadn't noticed before. It led to a narrow staircase descending into darkness. "Basement," Mark said. "Maybe there's a way out down there." Reluctantly, we crept down the creaking stairs. The air grew colder with each step, and a faint, metallic smell filled our noses. At the bottom, we found a small stone-walled room lit by a single, flickering bulb. Symbols were carved into the walls, strange, looping shapes that seemed to shift when you stared at them. "This doesn't look like an escape route," Sarah said, her voice barely a whisper. Before I could respond, the bulb flickered and went out. In the pitch black, we heard them, voices. Faint, almost unintelligible whispers surrounded us, growing louder with each passing second. "Turn on your phone light," Mark hissed. I fumbled for my phone. And when the beam of light finally cut through the darkness, it illuminated something far worse. A figure stood at the edge of the room, one of the masked intruders. His head tilted unnaturally. And he raised a hand to point at the center of the room, where a small table sat covered in rusted tools and scraps of paper. "Take it," the figure rasped. His voice was low and hollow, echoing in the confined space. "What do you want from us?" Sarah screamed. The figure didn't answer. Instead, the whispers grew deafening, a cacophony of overlapping voices that made my head spin. I grabbed Sarah's hand and pulled her toward the stairs. "Run!" I shouted. We bolted up the stairs and back into the mansion's main hall, but something had changed. The music was gone. The people were gone. The lights, the bonfire, even the cars outside, all vanished. "What the hell?" Mark whispered, looking around in disbelief. Then Sarah gasped and pointed to the second-floor landing. 3 figures stood there, their masks glowing faintly in the darkness. In the middle of them was the pale girl from earlier. Her expression blank. She raised her hand, pointing directly at us. The whispers returned, louder than ever, surrounding us as we fled into the night. To this day, I don't know what happened in that house. The police never found any evidence of a party, and no one I spoke to remembered being there. The mansion burned to the ground a week later, leaving nothing but ashes and questions. But sometimes, late at night, I still hear the whispers. And I know they're coming closer. Story 2. The Shadows of New Year's Eve. In late December 2012, I returned home one freezing night to find my younger sister, Lily, sitting by the living room window, staring into the darkened backyard with a blank expression. Her hands trembled as she gripped a cup of untouched tea. "What's wrong, Lil?" I asked, placing my bag on the chair. She didn't turn to look at me. Her voice was barely audible. "He's gone, Alex." "Who's gone?" I pressed. "Dad," she whispered, her voice cracking. "He left. Packed his things this afternoon while Mom was at work. He didn't even say goodbye." The words hit me like a freight train. Our family wasn't perfect, but I thought we were okay. Dad leaving felt like the floor beneath us had caved in. I tried to comfort Lily, but she retreated to her room, locking the door. Over the next few days, Mom and Lily avoided the house, deciding to spend the holidays at a friend's cabin upstate. I was left to take care of the place. Christmas passed in a haze of silence, and the emptiness of the house gnawed at me. By New Year's Eve, I couldn't take the isolation anymore. I invited a group of friends over for a small gathering, hoping to fill the void with laughter and noise. The night started well enough, music, drinks, and plenty of chatter. By 11 p.m., the house was alive with energy. But as the minutes ticked toward midnight, the mood shifted. It started subtly, flickering lights, odd noises from upstairs, and an unexplained chill that seeped into the living room. "Is the heater broken?" Julia, one of my closest friends, asked, rubbing her arms. I checked the thermostat. It was working fine. "Probably just the draft," I said, brushing it off. At midnight, we counted down, cheering as fireworks exploded in the distance. But the celebration was cut short when someone screamed from the kitchen. "Chris! Stop messing around!" Katie's voice rang out, sharp with anger. We all rushed to see what was happening. Chris, visibly drunk, stood in the corner of the dimly lit kitchen, muttering incoherently and staring at the pantry door. His girlfriend, Katie, looked both angry and scared. "What's going on?" I asked. "He's been acting weird all night," Katie said. "Now he's saying there's someone inside the pantry." "I swear I saw someone," Chris slurred, pointing at the door. Tall, with glowing eyes. They're watching us. I rolled my eyes. You've had too much to drink, man. Sit down before you hurt yourself. But Chris wouldn't move. His eyes stayed locked on the pantry door. They're still there, he whispered. Julia, trying to lighten the mood, laughed nervously. Okay, Chris. Let's open it together and show you there's no one there. She reached for the pantry handle. As soon as the door creaked open, Chris let out a guttural scream and bolted out of the kitchen, knocking over a chair in the process. Inside the pantry, there was nothing but neatly arranged cans and boxes. But the air felt heavy, like the room itself was holding its breath. Katie ran after Chris, who had disappeared upstairs. A few of us followed, calling his name. We found him in my parents' bedroom, sitting on the floor with his head in his hands. Chris, what's wrong? Katie knelt beside him. I saw her, he mumbled, rocking back and forth. She was standing behind the pantry door. It wasn't a person. It wasn't human. The room fell silent. Julia tried to laugh it off, but her voice wavered. You're drunk. Let's get you some water. Chris didn't respond. His eyes were unfocused, staring at something only he could see. Katie stayed with him while the rest of us went back downstairs. The party quickly fizzled out after that. Most of the guests left, leaving only a handful of us to clean up. Around 2 a.m., I heard footsteps coming from upstairs. Thinking it was Chris or Katie, I went to check. I found the bedroom empty, but the window was open, letting in a biting wind. The curtains fluttered eerily, and I noticed something strange on the windowsill, long, claw-like scratches etched into the wood. My heart raced as I closed the window. When I turned around, Julia was standing in the hallway, her face pale. Alex, the pantry door is open again, she said. We went downstairs together, the silence of the house pressing in on us. The pantry door stood ajar, swinging slightly as if moved by an unseen hand. Inside, the neatly arranged items from earlier were scattered across the floor, but there was something else, a wet footprint, too large and misshapen to belong to any of us. Chris? I called out, my voice trembling. No response. Suddenly, Katie screamed from upstairs. We rushed up to find her standing outside the bathroom, her hands covering her mouth. Inside, Chris was slumped over the sink, mumbling incoherently, his arms covered in deep scratches as if he'd clawed at himself. We need to call for help, Julia said, pulling out her phone. As I dialed, Chris looked up at me, his bloodshot eyes filled with terror. It's still here, he rasped. And it's not letting me go. Before I could respond, the bathroom door slammed shut, locking itself. We pounded on the door, yelling his name, but all we heard from the other side was his agonized screaming. Then, silence. When we finally broke the door down, Chris was gone. The bathroom window was shattered, but there was no sign of him outside, just those same claw-like marks on the sill. The police searched for weeks, but Chris was never found. Katie stopped answering my calls, and Julia refused to set foot in my house again. To this day, I still hear faint footsteps in the hallways late at night. And the pantry door sometimes opens on its own. Whatever Chris saw that night, I think it's still here, waiting for someone else to notice. Story 3. The Vanishing of Sarah Whitmore. On a cold New Year's Eve in 2016, 19-year-old Sarah Whitmore of Ashwood, Maine, left her evening shift at the Lakeside Diner with an air of excitement. Her plans for the night were simple: attend a cozy gathering with friends to welcome the new year. The snow whispered beneath her boots as she walked across the parking lot, her breath forming clouds in the icy air. But Sarah never made it to the party. By morning, she had vanished, leaving behind a web of questions and chilling possibilities. Sarah's life wasn't without its complications. 6 months earlier, she had ended a tumultuous relationship with her boyfriend, Ethan Marsh. The breakup was public and messy. The kind that a small town like Ashwood wouldn't stop whispering about. Ethan, known for his temper, had struggled to move on, frequently texting and calling Sarah despite her requests for distance. Still, Sarah had been optimistic about the new year, determined to leave the past behind and focus on her future. Around 7 p.m., Sarah clocked out of her shift and called her best friend, Lila, confirming the party's location. "I'll be there in an hour," she said, her voice light with excitement. But as she crossed the parking lot, she noticed a familiar figure leaning against a lamppost. "Ethan. What are you doing here?" Sarah asked, her voice tinged with annoyance. "We need to talk," Ethan replied, his breath misting in the cold air. "It's important." Sarah hesitated. "Not now. Ethan. I have plans." "Please, just 5 minutes," he insisted, stepping closer. "It's about us." Reluctantly, Sarah agreed. Witnesses later reported seeing the two engaged in what appeared to be an intense conversation before Sarah got into Ethan's truck. That was the last time anyone saw her. When Sarah failed to arrive at the party or answer her phone, Lila grew concerned. By morning, Sarah's parents reported her missing. The police quickly turned their attention to Ethan, who claimed he had dropped Sarah off near her home around 8:30 p.m. She said she wanted to take a walk, Ethan told investigators. "I thought it was weird, but she seemed fine." However, Sarah's footprints in the snow led not toward her house but to an abandoned hiking trail at the edge of town. The trail, overgrown and shrouded in shadow, had long been a local spot for urban legends. Residents spoke of the Whispering Pines, a stretch of woods said to swallow the unwary. As the investigation unfolded, another figure came into focus, Marcus Gale, a recluse who lived near the trail. Known for his eccentric behavior and unsettling demeanor, Marcus had been spotted wandering the woods on the night of Sarah's disappearance. When questioned, he offered a cryptic response. "The forest sees everything," Marcus muttered. "But it doesn't always tell." Adding to the mystery was a note found in Sarah's locker at the diner. Written in an elegant, unfamiliar hand, "The pines hold secrets. Be careful where you tread." Who had written the note? And what did it mean? Search parties combed the hiking trail, uncovering peculiar items, a torn scarf resembling Sarah's, an old locket inscribed with initials DM, and, most disturbingly, a fresh carving in a tree reading, "Not all who wander return." Forensic tests on the scarf were inconclusive, and Ethan denied any knowledge of the locket. Meanwhile, Marcus Gale's home revealed a collection of eerie sketches, including one that depicted a girl resembling Sarah standing at the edge of the forest. When pressed, Marcus simply smiled. "The forest likes her," he said. "It doesn't want to let go." Weeks turned into months with no sign of Sarah. Then, in late February, a local fisherman reported finding a cell phone partially buried in snow near the frozen lake at the forest's edge. The phone was Sarah's, and its last recorded video sent shivers down investigators' spines. The grainy footage showed Sarah walking through the woods, her breath quickening as she whispered, "I hear them, they're calling my name." Moments later, the camera jolted, capturing a glimpse of shadowy figures in the trees before cutting to black. Despite extensive searches and countless interviews, Sarah Whitmore's fate remains unknown. Ethan was eventually cleared of suspicion, though whispers about his involvement persist. Marcus Gale disappeared from Ashwood shortly after the investigation stalled, leaving behind only his cryptic sketches and ominous words. To this day, locals avoid the Whispering Pines, where Sarah's laughter once echoed. The trail has grown darker, the legends more sinister. Some claim to hear her voice on quiet nights, calling for help. Others say the forest itself knows the truth but keeps its secrets buried deep. And as for Sarah Whitmore, her story lingers like the frost in the air, cold, mysterious, and forever unanswered. Story 4. The upscale suburb of Greenwood Hollow in Sydney, Australia, was an enclave of luxury, its sprawling mansions hidden behind towering hedges and wrought-iron gates. Among these opulent residences was the estate of Henry Caldwell, a 47-year-old entrepreneur who had amassed his fortune in tech ventures. Despite the grandeur of his home, Henry was rarely seen by his neighbors, often retreating to his private penthouse in downtown Sydney under the guise of business obligations. On the evening of December 28, 2010, Henry's wife, Evelyn, hosted an extravagant cocktail party at their estate to celebrate the year's success. The guest list included wealthy investors, influential politicians, and a smattering of celebrities. Yet, as glasses of champagne clinked and laughter filled the air, one person was conspicuously absent: Henry. "Where's your husband?" a guest asked Evelyn, who was mingling with a glass of rose in hand. "Oh, Henry must be upstairs in his study," Evelyn replied breezily. "He's been so busy with work lately." Little did she know, Henry would never descend those stairs again. 2 days later, Evelyn and her son, Matthew, ventured into Henry's secluded study on the 3rd floor after noticing an unusual smell. The door creaked open, revealing a ghastly scene. Henry's lifeless body sprawled across the floor, blood pooling around his head. His face was bruised and distorted, his hand clutching a torn page from a notebook. Evelyn let out a blood-curdling scream, while Matthew staggered back, his face pale. "Mom, what is this?" he stammered. Evelyn couldn't respond, her trembling hand clutching her chest. Detective Charlotte Harris arrived at the scene shortly after. A seasoned investigator known for her meticulous attention to detail, she surveyed the room. Her sharp eyes taking in every detail: the overturned chair, the shattered whiskey glass, and the cryptic symbols scrawled on the wall in blood. "Mrs. Caldwell, did Henry have enemies?" Charlotte asked. Evelyn hesitated, glancing at Matthew before replying. "Not that I know of. But, he's been stressed. Work, debts, and there were rumors he was being threatened." Matthew interjected, his voice tight. "Mom, what about the safe? Didn't Dad say he kept something important there?" Charlotte's interest peaked. "A safe? Show me." Evelyn led them to a hidden panel in the wall, revealing a small safe. It had been forced open. Inside were only scraps of paper, including what seemed to be fragments of a ledger and a partially burned photograph of Henry with a woman who wasn't Evelyn. As the investigation unfolded, more secrets spilled out. Henry had been deeply in debt, owing millions to dubious lenders. Evelyn, the beneficiary of his $5 million life insurance policy, became an immediate suspect. However, her alibi, being surrounded by guests at the party, was airtight. Meanwhile, Matthew's behavior grew increasingly erratic. "I'll find who did this," he muttered repeatedly, often locking himself in his room for hours. When Charlotte pressed him about his father's dealings, he became defensive. "Dad had his secrets," Matthew admitted during one interrogation. "But he was trying to fix things. He told me he had a plan to make it all right." Charlotte's suspicion deepened and the forensic team found traces of blood on Matthew's sneakers. Confronted with this evidence, Matthew broke down. "I didn't kill him," he cried. "I found him that night. I tried to help, but he was already dead. I panicked." "Why didn't you call for help?" Charlotte pressed. Matthew hesitated. "Because I thought Mom did it." The plot thickened when another woman came forward, Lydia Trent, one of Henry's business partners. She claimed Henry had confided in her about a shadowy figure threatening him. "He called him the Collector," Lydia explained. He said this man wouldn't stop until he got what he wanted. What did he want? Charlotte asked. Lydia shook her head. Henry never told me. As Charlotte pieced together the fragments, she discovered a chilling note hidden among Henry's belongings. It read, "To those I've wronged, you will find what you're looking for in the ledger." But the ledger was missing. One night, as Evelyn wandered the halls of the mansion, she heard a faint whispering from Henry's study. "Henry," she called, her voice trembling. She stepped inside, only to find the room empty. On the desk lay the torn notebook page Henry had clutched in his hand, now eerily intact and covered in more cryptic symbols. Terrified, Evelyn fled, her screams waking Matthew, who rushed to her side. Despite Charlotte's relentless investigation, the case grew colder with each passing day. The mansion's walls seemed to hold more secrets than answers. And rumors of hauntings began to circulate. Some claimed to see Henry's silhouette in the windows, while others swore they heard his voice echoing in the halls. The final chilling twist came a year later when a new family moved into the Caldwell mansion. In the attic, they discovered a hidden compartment containing the missing ledger. Its pages were filled with names, dates, and amounts, a record of Henry's dealings with dangerous individuals. But one page stood out, an entry for December 28, 2010. Next to the date was a single name, written in Henry's trembling hand, Evelyn. The truth remains buried in Greenwood Hollow, leaving behind only whispers, shadows, and an unsolved mystery that chills the bones of all who hear it. Story 5. The Silent Night at Forward Base Avaris. The icy winds of northern Afghanistan howled against the sandbag walls of Forward Operating Base Avaris. It was New Year's Eve, and the base was shrouded in an oppressive quiet. Staff Sergeant Matthew Crow shivered as he pulled his jacket tighter, his thoughts drifting back to his family, his wife, Lily, and his 7-year-old son. Max Crow had missed Max's birthday this year and now another holiday. He sighed, staring out into the frozen expanse beyond the perimeter, the cold gnawing at his resolve. Inside the dimly lit barracks, Private Riley Daniels tossed a deck of cards onto a rickety table. Poker? Or are we gonna sit here whining about the cold all night? He joked, flashing a grin that barely masked his exhaustion. Crow smirked. Poker's fine. Just don't start crying when I clean you out again. As they shuffled the cards, Specialist Hannah Ortiz pushed through the door, her face pale, her rifle slung low as if it weighed 100 pounds. "Did you guys hear that?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Hear what?" Crow replied, raising an eyebrow. "A voice," Ortiz said, gripping her rifle tighter. "Out by the comms tower. It sounded like someone calling my name." Daniels chuckled nervously. "Probably just the wind. Or maybe one of those feral dogs messing with you." Ortiz shook her head. "No. It wasn't a dog. It was human. But weird. Like, distorted." Crow stood. His curiosity piqued. "I'll check it out. Probably just some idiot from another unit messing around. You two stay here." "Wait, you're going alone?" Ortiz asked, her voice edged with concern. "I'll be fine. Relax," Crow said with a faint smile. "If I'm not back in 10, you can come rescue me." He grabbed his rifle and stepped out into the biting cold. The base was eerily silent, save for the occasional groan of the wind. As he approached the comms tower, the sense of isolation deepened. The structure loomed ahead, skeletal and dark against the faint moonlight. "Hello?" Crow called, his voice echoing into the stillness. There was no response. Then, faintly, he heard it, a whisper. "Matthew." Crow froze. His heart thumped against his ribs as he scanned the area with his flashlight. "Who's there?" Show yourself. The whisper came again, closer this time, his name drawn out like a hiss. His breath fogged in the freezing air as he raised his rifle, his finger hovering over the trigger. The flashlight beam caught a flicker of movement, a shadow darting behind the base of the tower. Stop! Crow shouted, advancing cautiously. He rounded the corner and stopped dead. A figure crouched in the shadows, its body contorted unnaturally. When it turned to face him, Crow felt a chill deeper than the winter air. Its face was hollow, its eyes empty sockets, yet he felt them staring directly into his soul. The thing opened its mouth, emitting a guttural, inhuman screech. Crow staggered back, fumbling to fire, but his limbs felt leaden. The shadow lunged, and the world around him went black. Back in the barracks, Daniels and Ortiz heard the faint echo of gunfire. They exchanged a tense glance before grabbing their weapons and running toward the comms tower. When they arrived, they found Crow lying in the dirt, his body pale and cold, his rifle untouched beside him. The medics declared Crow dead on the scene, though the cause was unclear. No wounds, no signs of struggle. Just the frozen look of terror etched on his face. The base went into immediate lockdown. Rumors spread quickly among the soldiers. Some whispered about a Taliban breach. Others spoke of something far more sinister. But no tracks or signs of infiltration were found. As the days passed, the whispers grew. Ortiz swore she heard her name called again one night. And Daniel started avoiding the comms tower altogether. Weeks later, the military issued a terse statement. Staff Sergeant Matthew Crow had died in the line of duty and was posthumously awarded medals for bravery. But no further details were released. One cold night, Daniels found himself unable to sleep. Drawn by a strange compulsion, he wandered out to the comms tower. The air was heavy, the silence suffocating. As he stood there, staring at the frost-covered ground, he heard it again. Riley. He spun around, his heart hammering in his chest. The night was empty, yet the voice came again, closer this time, soft and insistent. Riley, help me. A shadow flickered at the edge of his vision. He turned, his flashlight catching only empty air. The whisper rose to a low, guttural moan, and the air around him grew colder. Daniel stumbled back, dropping his flashlight, and ran. The next morning, his bunk was empty. His belongings untouched. No one saw Daniels again, and no one dared approach the comms tower. The base was abandoned shortly after, the remaining soldiers reassigned without explanation. Years later, Lily Crow received her husband's medals in a somber ceremony. She placed them on the mantel, staring at the cold, polished surfaces. That night, as she sat in her living room, the TV flickered to life on its own. Static filled the screen. And through the crackling noise, she heard a whisper. Lily. She froze, her blood running cold. The screen went dark, leaving her in silence. Then, faintly, the whisper came again. Help me. The lights in the house flickered, and the shadows in the corners seemed to grow darker. What happened at Forward Base Avarice remains classified, shrouded in mystery and silence. The whispers were dismissed as superstition, but those who heard them knew the truth. Something was there, and it was waiting. The shadows of New Year's Eve. Back in university, my flatmates and I had a running joke we called Spectre's Snatch. It was a silly game inspired by an urban legend about a spirit that would steal drinks left unattended for too long. The rule was simple: if someone put their drink down for more than a few seconds, another person could swoop in, shout "Spectre's Snatch," and guzzle it down. What started as a joke quickly became tradition, especially during our late-night gatherings. Our flat was an eerie yet charming Victorian townhouse in Edinburgh, a place that seemed alive with whispers from its creaking walls and drafty hallways. By second year, It was our haven for study sessions and wild parties. That New Year's Eve, we decided to throw an extravagant bash. Everyone was invited, including a few newcomers. One of them was Isla, a friend's cousin who had an enigmatic presence about her, quiet, but with a piercing gaze that seemed to follow you even when you weren't looking. The party was in full swing by 11 p.m. Music boomed. People danced, and drinks flowed freely. I was perched on the edge of the couch, chatting with my flatmate Callum and Isla, who had finally cracked a smile after her third glass of wine. The game of Spectre's Snatch had made its rounds, and Callum seemed particularly eager to swipe drinks that night, much to everyone's annoyance. As the clock struck midnight, Callum handed Isla a glass of champagne, claiming it was from the bottle he'd reserved for special guests. "Cheers to a mysterious new year," Callum said with a wink. Isla studied the glass. "Mysterious indeed," she murmured, her voice barely audible over the music. She took a small sip, then set it down. Her expression darkened, and she mumbled something about feeling unwell. I watched her closely. "You all right?" "I'm fine," she said curtly. Her gaze flicked to Callum, who seemed oblivious, laughing at a joke someone told nearby. Without thinking, I swooped in and yelled, "Spectre's Snatch." Everyone laughed as I downed the glass, though the champagne tasted oddly bitter. "That's not funny," Isla said sharply, her voice cutting through the laughter. Her eyes were fixed on me, unblinking. Before I could respond, a cold, suffocating sensation swept over me. The room spun, and before I could call out, darkness swallowed me. I woke up in a dimly lit hospital room, my throat raw and my limbs leaden. A nurse appeared, explaining I'd been found unconscious and brought in by ambulance. She said I'd overdosed on something, though I insisted I hadn't taken any drugs. My mind raced as I recalled the champagne. Later, the doctor confirmed my suspicions. My blood work revealed traces of a powerful sedative, zolpidem, commonly misused to incapacitate people. The realization hit me like a tidal wave: someone had spiked that drink. But why? Callum visited me the next day, his demeanor anxious and jittery. "You scared the hell out of us, mate," he said, forcing a nervous laugh. "What happened?" I asked, my voice hoarse. "You just collapsed." Isla freaked out and left. "Said she wasn't feeling well," Callum said, avoiding my gaze. "Isla left?" I asked, my mind flashing back to her sharp words before I blacked out. "Why?" He shrugged. "She's odd." That detail nagged at me. Isla had been quiet but friendly all night. Why would she leave without a word? I decided to confront her. Finding her address through a mutual friend. Her flat was in an older part of town, the kind of place where shadows seemed to stretch endlessly. She opened the door slightly, her pale face peeking through the crack. "You're lucky to be alive," she said before I could speak, her voice low and trembling. "That drink wasn't meant for you." "What do you mean?" I demanded, my stomach tightening. "It was meant for him," she whispered, her eyes darting down the hall as if someone might be listening. "Callum. I know what he's done." "What are you talking about?" I stepped closer, but she pushed the door shut further, leaving only a sliver of her face visible. "You need to stay away from him. He's dangerous." Her voice wavered, but her eyes remained locked on mine. "Isla, I need answers. What happened that night?" She hesitated, her lips parting as if to speak, but then a noise from inside her flat made her freeze. "I've said too much. Just, be careful." And with that, she shut the door. I confronted Callum that night, piecing together fragments of Isla's warning and my own suspicions. He was sitting in the living room, scrolling through his phone. Callum, we need to talk, I said, my tone firm. He looked up, feigning confusion. What about? The champagne. The sedative. Isla said it was meant for you. What the hell is going on? His expression shifted, a flicker of panic before he forced a laugh. You've been talking to Isla? Mate, she's crazy. Always has been. Crazy or not, she's scared of you. And frankly, so am I. Callum's face darkened. You don't know what you're talking about. Then explain it to me, I demanded, stepping closer. What did you put in her drink? He stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. You're accusing me? After everything? You think I'd hurt someone? I think you're hiding something. I shot back. For a moment, we stared each other down. Then, without another word, Callum grabbed his coat and stormed out of the flat. Days turned into weeks with no sign of Callum. Until a chilling discovery was made. His body was found near an abandoned train yard, his expression frozen in terror. The autopsy revealed no foul play. But whispers spread through campus about Isla's connection to the incident. Some claimed to have seen her around the train yard that night, her piercing gaze locked on the shadows. To this day, I can't shake the feeling that there's more to Isla's story. Who was she really? And what had she meant when she said the drink was meant for Callum? The answers remain buried in the silence of that Victorian flat, where whispers still linger in the shadows. The whispers in the shadows. I was a rookie cop back then, about 10 years ago, working the late shift on a foggy autumn night. The call came in around 3 a.m. A woman claiming to hear whispers in her attic while she was cleaning up after a late dinner. She lived alone, recently widowed, no kids. Her voice over the phone was trembling, filled with dread. When we arrived, she was outside on the sidewalk, pacing under a flickering streetlight. Her neighbor stood beside her, clutching a flashlight. "Officer, thank God you're here," she stammered, clutching a shawl tightly around her shoulders. It started with whispers, soft at first, then louder. And now there's humming. I swear someone's in there. Humming, my partner, Officer Davis asked, raising an eyebrow. Yes, but not like a song, more like someone was making it up as they went along. It's wrong. It doesn't feel right. Her voice broke as she spoke, her eyes darting nervously toward the house. We'll take a look, I assured her. Stay here with your neighbor. The house greeted us with eerie silence, broken only by the faint tick of a grandfather clock. It was immaculate, as if frozen in time. Davis and I exchanged a glance. This place gives me the creeps, he muttered, unholstering his flashlight. You feel that? Yeah, I replied. Like we're being watched. As we cleared the ground floor, I noticed faint smudges on the walls, childlike handprints. Smeared and uneven. The air felt colder as we approached the staircase, the kind of cold that seemed to seep into your bones. Then we heard it, humming, faint and rhythmic, coming from the attic. Police! I called out. Whoever's up there, come down now. The humming stopped. For a moment, there was only silence, then a soft, giggling laugh, childlike but off, as if distorted. Davis froze. Did you hear that? Yeah, I whispered. Let's move. The stairs creaked under our weight as we ascended, our flashlights cutting through the darkness. At the top, the attic door stood slightly ajar. Scratching sounds echoed from within. We're police officers. Davis shouted. Come out with your hands up. A pause, then a high-pitched voice replied. I'm not done playing yet. We exchanged uneasy glances. The voice was wrong, too high-pitched and disjointed, like a recording played at the wrong speed. All right, enough games, Davis muttered. Let's go. I pushed the door open, my flashlight illuminating the dim attic. The light bulb above swung gently, casting shifting shadows across the room. In the center sat a figure, a man. Thin and gaunt, hunched over a vanity table. His back was to us. "Sir, step away from the table," I ordered. The man didn't move. Instead, he whispered, "You shouldn't be here. They don't like when people interrupt the game." "Who's they?" Davis asked, his voice sharp. The man chuckled softly, the sound sending chills down my spine. "You'll see," he whispered. "They like new players. Sir, stand up and face us." I shouted. Slowly, he turned his head. His face was a nightmare, pale, gaunt, and smeared with blood. His eyes were wide, unblinking. And his lips stretched into a grotesque grin. "Why are you smiling?" Davis asked, his voice cracking slightly. "They're here," the man said simply, his voice distorted, layered with faint echoes. "Who's here?" I demanded, stepping closer. Instead of answering, he raised a shard of glass from the vanity table, holding it to his wrist. "They told me to open the door," he whispered. "The real door. Put it down," Davis yelled. The man's grin widened. "It's too late. They're already watching you." The air in the room grew heavy, the shadows deepening. The giggling returned. Louder and overlapping, as if multiple children were laughing at once. My flashlight flickered, the beam cutting in and out. "Davis," I whispered, my voice trembling. "Do you hear that?" Before he could respond, the man slashed his wrist. Blood dripped onto the floor, soaking into the wood. The giggling turned into screams, high-pitched, overlapping, and coming from every direction. The man began to hum again, his voice blending with the screams. "Do you like the song?" he asked, tilting his head. "It's for you." The attic door slammed shut behind us. Davis spun around. Pounding on it. "It won't open," he shouted. I turned back to the man, but he was gone. In his place was a single broken doll, its glass eyes glinting in the dim light. "What the hell is going on?" Davis muttered, his voice barely audible. The shadows seemed to move, creeping closer. The screams faded, replaced by a low, guttural growl. "Who's there?" I shouted. My voice echoing in the confined space. The growl turned into a whisper, a voice so faint I could barely make it out. "You shouldn't have come." The light bulb above us shattered, plunging the attic into darkness. My flashlight flickered back on, but the room was empty. No doll, no blood, no man, just an empty, silent attic. We searched the house and the surrounding area. But there was no trace of the intruder. The woman moved out the next day, leaving everything behind. She refused to talk about what happened, and the case was quietly closed. But sometimes, late at night, I still hear that humming. And every now and then, I see those handprints smeared on walls that were supposed to be clean. I'll never know what was in that attic, or who, or what was playing that game. And I'm not sure I want to. Story 8. The Echo in the Woods. I've spent most of my life as a wilderness guide, leading expeditions deep into the remote forests of northern Alaska. I prefer solitude. Having grown up in foster care, I never really built strong ties with anyone. That's why working during holidays, when everyone else was home with family, always felt right. It was New Year's Eve of 2012, and I was stationed at an isolated outpost with one colleague, Alex. The plan was simple: monitor the site, keep the equipment running, and enjoy a few quiet drinks to welcome the new year. The forest was vast, the snow untouched except for the tracks we'd made earlier that day. Perfect isolation. Or so I thought. Think anyone's crazy enough to come out here tonight? Alex asked, raising his mug of steaming coffee. I laughed. Only if they're running from something worse. The wind howled outside, rattling the cabin windows. It was 10 p.m., and we were halfway through a bottle of whiskey when my radio crackled. Static, sharp and sudden, cut through the cabin's warmth. Help, he's. The words were faint, distorted, but unmistakably human. I froze, the glass halfway to my lips. Did you hear that? Alex nodded, frowning. Someone's out there. I grabbed the flashlight and threw on my coat. Alex followed, his rifle slung over his shoulder. The radio in my hand buzzed again. Help, woods, near the ridge, then silence. We stepped into the freezing night, the beam of my flashlight cutting through the swirling snow. I scanned the area, and that's when I saw the footprints. Bare, human footprints. Leading toward the tree line. No boots? Alex muttered, kneeling to inspect them. Who walks barefoot in this cold? The prints were fresh, blood smeared along the edges. They led into the forest, disappearing into the shadows. We should call for backup, Alex said, unease creeping into his voice. But something compelled me to follow. It's New Year's. Closest help is hours away. We can't leave them out there. Reluctantly, Alex nodded. We followed the tracks, the crunch of snow underfoot the only sound. The forest was alive with the creaks of frozen branches and the low whistle of the wind. Suddenly, I spotted movement, a figure darting between the trees. Hey! I shouted, raising my flashlight. The figure stopped. A man, pale and gaunt, stood just beyond the beam of light. His eyes locked onto mine, wide with terror. He was shirtless, his skin ghostly against the dark woods. What happened? I called out, stepping closer. The man didn't answer. Instead, he raised a trembling hand, pointing behind me. I turned. The forest was empty. When I looked back, he was gone. The snow beneath him undisturbed, as if he had vanished into thin air. Alex cursed under his breath. This is bad, man. Real bad. The radio crackled again. This time, the voice was different. Cold. Familiar. Turn back, or you won't make it. The voice was mine. What the hell is this? Alex whispered, his grip tightening on the rifle. Panic surged through me. But I forced myself to stay calm. We're being messed with. Someone's playing a sick joke. The radio buzzed again, and the same voice spoke, the cabin isn't safe. That's when the cabin lights flickered in the distance. Then, they went out entirely. We ran back, hearts pounding. The snowstorm was picking up, the wind howling like a banshee. When we reached the cabin, the door was wide open, swinging on its hinges. Inside, the scene was surreal. Our things were untouched, but there, sitting at the table, was a figure in my clothes. His back was to me, his head slightly tilted as if listening. Who are you? I demanded, raising the flashlight. The figure didn't move. Alex aimed his rifle. Answer him. Slowly. The figure turned. My breath caught in my throat. I was staring at myself. Same face, same clothes, but the eyes were black as coal. What do you want? I asked, my voice trembling. The doppelganger smiled. You. Before I could react, the flashlight flickered and died. The room plunged into darkness. Alex shouted, the sound of a scuffle breaking out beside me. I fumbled for the flashlight, my hands shaking. When the light finally came back on, Alex was gone. Only his rifle lay on the floor, covered in blood. The doppelganger was gone too. the door swinging open to the storm outside. "Alex!" I screamed, stepping into the night. The snow swirled violently, and the forest seemed to close in around me. "Where are you?" Only the wind answered. Desperate, I picked up the radio. "Alex, can you hear me? Say something." Static filled the line, then a faint, chilling whisper, "You can't escape." The voice wasn't mine this time. It wasn't Alex's either. I searched for Alex until dawn, but there was no trace of him. No footprints, no signs of struggle, just the rifle and the blood. The radio was dead, the cabin eerily silent. I left that outpost the next day, never speaking of what happened. To this day, I don't know what I saw or where Alex went. But sometimes, in the dead of night, I hear my own voice on the wind, whispering the same chilling words. The cabin isn't safe. Story 9. The Whispering Shadow. I lost my uncle Marcus recently. His real name was Michael, but everyone in the family called him Marcus. No one ever explained why. It seemed to suit him better. Like it was a name he had chosen to distance himself from something, or someone. Marcus was a peculiar man, to put it lightly. He had an unsettling fascination with ancient artifacts. Especially those with dark histories. He wasn't a collector, he couldn't afford to be. Instead, he worked as a restorer, patching up relics for museums or private collectors. Yet, he often muttered about the ones he couldn't restore, objects he claimed were too far gone or not meant to be fixed. As a child, I found him intriguing but also a little terrifying. He was mostly quiet, but when he spoke, it was in cryptic phrases that left you more confused than enlightened. He always seemed distracted, like he was listening to something none of us could hear. When he passed, we discovered that he had left behind a journal. My cousin Claire and I decided to read it together one rainy evening. The first half of the journal was mundane, notes about his work, appointments, and a few personal musings. But then the entries became fragmented and strange. Entry, March 14th. The artifact arrived today, a shattered obsidian mask, black as midnight. Even in pieces, it feels alive. I don't like the way it hums when I'm near. No one else seems to hear it. Entry, March 21st. I shouldn't have agreed to restore it. The fractures seal themselves overnight, as if the mask wants to be whole again. Sometimes, I think I hear whispers. Claire shivered as she read that last line. "Do you think he actually heard something?" she asked. "I don't know," I replied, though I didn't sound convincing, even to myself. Maybe it was just his imagination. He was always a bit off. But Claire wasn't convinced. She kept flipping through the pages, her eyes growing wider with each entry. Entry, April 2nd. Last night, I woke up to the sound of breathing. The mask was on the table across the room, but it felt closer. The whispers have grown louder. They aren't words, not exactly. More like commands I can't quite understand. "Breathing?" Claire repeated, her voice trembling. Why didn't he tell anyone about this? He was always a little weird, but this is something else. "I don't know," I muttered, feeling a chill crawl up my spine. But I always knew something wasn't right with him. I just never realized how deep it went. Claire closed the journal with a snap, her hand shaking. "We need to figure out what happened. What if this mask was the reason why he died?" I finished for her. The room felt colder now. "I don't want to think about that." Claire stood up. Her eyes wide, a sudden sense of urgency in her voice. "We need to find it. Now." I felt a pit form in my stomach. "Are you sure? What if it's too dangerous?" she interrupted, pacing. "Look. He left us this for a reason. He wanted us to know. We have to finish what he started. Against my better judgment, I agreed. We grabbed a flashlight and descended into the basement. The stairs creaked under our weight, the air thick with dust and a strange smell, something faintly metallic. At the bottom, the basement stretched out before us, cluttered with old furniture, unused tools, and boxes of forgotten heirlooms. Where do we even start? I asked, my voice echoing in the dim light. Claire's gaze scanned the room, landing on an old wooden pedestal in the center of the room. The air felt heavier around it, like something was drawing us in. There, she whispered. It has to be there. We moved toward it, our footsteps unnervingly loud in the silence. But when we reached the pedestal, it was empty. What the hell? Claire muttered, her breath quickening. It was here. I'm sure of it. I stepped closer, feeling a strange unease. Maybe someone took it. Or maybe Marcus. Don't say it, Claire snapped, her voice suddenly sharp. She sounded more desperate now, more frantic. We need to find it. We need to finish what Marcus couldn't. She started searching the basement, rifling through boxes, flipping open old crates. But there was no sign of the mask. Suddenly, a low, guttural whisper filled the room. My heart skipped a beat. It wasn't just the wind, it was a voice, clear and distinct, but strange. Almost like it was, inside my head. I froze, straining to hear. Do you hear that? I whispered, turning to Claire. Her face had gone ashen. She nodded, barely audible. It's the same sound Marcus described. The whispering. The voice grew louder. But it wasn't just one voice. Now there were two. Three. They were calling, chanting, overlapping, all speaking at once. The room seemed to distort around us, the shadows stretching unnaturally. Claire grabbed my arm, her grip tight. We need to get out of here. Now. But before we could move, the temperature in the room dropped sharply. A shadow, tall and slender, appeared at the far end of the basement. It was humanoid, but not quite human. Its edges were blurry, like smoke. And there, in the center of its face, an obsidian mask. My breath caught in my throat. Is that Marcus? The figure didn't answer. Instead, it tilted its head, as though considering us. The whispering grew louder, more urgent, but now it wasn't coming from the figure. It was coming from all around us. The walls. The floor. The ceiling. Get out. Claire screamed, pulling me toward the stairs. But the figure stepped forward, blocking our path. It was taller now. Its body stretching unnaturally. Do you think you can escape it? The voice, harsh and cold, seemed to emanate from the mask. Claire tugged harder on my arm, but the shadow seemed to ripple. As if it were alive. Why didn't he tell us? I whispered, my voice breaking. Because he couldn't, Claire replied, her face twisted in fear. The mask, whatever it is, it won't let anyone leave. It's already claimed him. Suddenly, the whispering stopped. The room fell silent. The shadow loomed over us, its presence suffocating. Leave. The figure finally said, its voice sharp and final. It stepped aside, revealing the basement door, now ajar, leading back into the house. We didn't wait for another second. We ran. As we reached the door, I looked back, but the shadow was gone. The basement was empty. Still. We slammed the door shut behind us and leaned against it, breathless, hearts racing. I don't understand, Claire gasped, her voice trembling. What was that? What happened to Marcus? I didn't have an answer. The house felt wrong. Something had changed. The air was heavy with something ancient, something we weren't supposed to understand. But as we stood there, trying to calm our breaths, I heard it. A whisper, faint and distant. Like a memory long forgotten. A whisper that was coming from somewhere in the house. Don't leave. The mask was still here. The forgotten farm. Back when I was in high school, I was deeply into something we called urbex, urban exploration. It's the art of discovering abandoned, decaying places. And for my best friend Matt and me, it was an obsession. We'd explore the city's forgotten buildings, each time searching for something stranger than the last. But this time, we wanted to do something different, something more isolated. On New Year's Day, everything in our small town seemed eerily quiet. Most businesses were closed, the streets empty. It felt like the perfect time to check out a farmstead that no one seemed to remember. My buddy Matt had heard of it from some locals, and rumor had it that it had been abandoned for years. We were looking for something big to explore, and a farm in the middle of nowhere sounded like the perfect spot. After a long drive, we turned onto an overgrown gravel road. Our tires crunching against the silent earth. The road twisted and curled around a dark expanse of land before leading us to a collection of old, dilapidated barns and houses. The entire place had this unsettling stillness to it. No signs of life. No cars. Not a single soul. We parked near the edge of the property and got out, the cold winter air biting into our skin. This place is wrong, Matt muttered, eyeing the barn that loomed ahead. Right? I said, half joking, trying to make light of the feeling creeping up my spine. It's perfect. Let's go. We'd seen worse places, downtown had its fair share of forgotten ruins, but something about the farmstead felt different. It was almost like the land itself had been abandoned, left to rot. The buildings were covered in ivy and moss, windows shattered, the silence unsettling. We started to move toward the first barn, but that's when we heard it, a soft squeal. It sounded like a pig, but strange. Distant, but almost desperate. Matt paused. You hear that? Yeah, I said, my voice low. It's a pig, right? We looked around, but there was no one. I'd passed by this place dozens of times before, and I was sure there hadn't been anyone living here. Still, the sound lingered, floating through the air like it didn't belong. We continued to walk. Hoping it was nothing, but the squeals grew louder. Matt was visibly uncomfortable now. Maybe it's time we leave, man. This place feels off, he said, his voice tinged with unease. I shook my head. No way. We're here now. Let's just check it out, make sure no one's keeping animals locked up or something. We kept walking, and soon enough, we found the barn where the sounds were coming from. It was a massive, old structure made of red brick, with a heavy iron door. As we got closer, the squeals turned into grunts, sharp, pitiful, and urgent. It was too strange to ignore. Maybe it's trapped, I suggested, my curiosity getting the better of me. Matt wasn't so sure. Man, I don't know. Something's wrong here. We searched around the perimeter, looking for an entrance. The door was locked tight, but there was a vent on the side, just large enough to peer through. We crouched down. My heart racing with anticipation. I leaned forward, pressing my eye against the metal grate, the darkness inside swallowing my vision. For a moment, there was nothing. Then, a shape moved in the shadows. I stiffened, my breath catching. Suddenly, a pair of eyes, bright, unnatural, glared back at me from the darkness. It was a human face, pale and gaunt, peering directly at me through the bars. My blood ran cold. I jerked back, stumbling into Matt. What the hell? He whispered, looking around in panic. Before I could respond, a voice, faint but clear, reached us from the other side of the grate. "Help me," it said. I froze. "Matt. You heard that, right?" He nodded, his face going pale. "Yeah. What the hell is going on here?" I was about to say something, but Matt grabbed my arm. "We need to get out of here. Now." But before we could move, a low groan echoed from inside. A hand, skeletal and white, appeared through a small gap in the vent. It curled slowly, as if beckoning us in. I felt my stomach churn. It wasn't a pig, it wasn't anything I could explain. "We need to call the cops," I whispered, already pulling out my phone. Matt didn't argue. We rushed back to the car, panic setting in. The whole time, I kept hearing the voice, the eyes staring back at me. It was as if the place itself had something sinister living within it. Once in the car, I dialed 911, trying to steady my voice. "I think someone's trapped in an abandoned farm. Please. You need to send someone out here, there's a person in that barn." The dispatcher assured me help was on the way. We drove off, speeding back to town, and I couldn't shake the image of those eyes. The coldness of the hand reaching out. The next day, I received a call from the sheriff. I thought he was going to thank us, maybe even praise us for finding a victim. But when he arrived at my house, his demeanor was anything but congratulatory. "I need to speak with you," he said, his voice cold. My parents stepped out of the room, and I sat down nervously. He stared at me for a moment before speaking. "You lied, didn't you?" I was stunned. "What?" "No, The farmstead," he interrupted. "My deputies went out there. The barn was open. But there was no one inside. Just animals. No people. No victims." "You're telling me you heard a person's voice?" I swallowed hard. "Yes. It was a man's voice. I'm not lying." He leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. "You saw nothing but a pig. Nothing more." I felt the blood drain from my face. My voice caught in my throat. "You're saying, there was no one in there?" The sheriff didn't respond. He just stood up and walked toward the door. "If you ever make a false report like that again," he said, glancing back at me with something cold in his eyes, "I'll make sure you regret it." After he left, I sat in silence for a long time. The sheriff's words echoed in my head. "You didn't see anything but a pig." But I knew what I saw. And I knew the voice I heard. 2 weeks later, I returned to the farm. No one had ever been there to investigate. The barn was still open, empty. No signs of anyone. But when I stood there, staring at the place, I felt it again, the oppressive sense of being watched, the creeping dread of something not quite right. And then, as I turned to leave, I heard it. The faint squeal of a pig. But this time, it sounded like a warning. The story leaves a lingering sense of mystery, the true nature of what happened at the farmstead unresolved. And the unsettling possibility that something sinister still lurks there, waiting for its next visitor.